These are the diseases. And we do not vaccinate against scarlet fever. We never have vaccinated against scarlet fever. And interestingly, the incidence of scarlet fever has dropped off, paralleling the drop in whooping cough and polio and so on. So it would appear, when we actually consider these other factors as well, that it's not the vaccines that have reduced the incidence of these diseases, but other things that were going on in society at the time. There were basic public health measures and sanitation measures, and these seem to be the things that have made the major impact.
And some of the studies that have been done indicating that it wasn't the cure-all that everybody thought it would be, and that in fact there have been some massive disasters around the world following vaccination programs. And that measles, for example, was dying out in Europe, and then they started the vaccination program, and it rose again. And that the thing that had cured measles was in fact the better nutrition programs, a simple general pick-up in the health of the population, increase in vitamin A levels. And the vaccination wasn't solving these problems at all. Just as many people were getting sick post-vaccination as they were before.
So not only does it appear that vaccines do not work, but there is evidence that they are in fact counterproductive. Back to the United States.
This is the incidence of whooping cough, morbidity and mortality from whooping cough, deaths from whooping cough between 1922 and 1987. You can see a steady downward trend in both morbidity and mortality until about 1978. I wrote this down here myself. Because after 1978 you can see this very unnatural, sharp upswing in the incidence of whooping cough, and mortality remained stationary.
So what happened in 1978?
In 1978, a nationwide childhood immunization initiative was begun. Individual states passed legislation requiring proof of immunization for school entry at 5 and 6 years of age. They mandated vaccination, and it resulted in a threefold increase in the reported incidence of whooping cough. And indeed, children develop whooping cough from the vaccine. And when I say that, of course, vaccinators are up in arms, saying that a child cannot contract whooping cough from the vaccine. But of course, because Bordetella pertussis is dead in the vaccine. But whooping cough is a toxin-mediated disease, meaning it doesn't matter whether Bordetella in the vaccine is live or dead, or whether it is there at all. Because the acellular whooping cough vaccine doesn't contain whole cell Bordetella pertussis. It only contains the protein envelopes. And children can still develop whooping cough from that vaccine.
After 20 years of immunisation in 1989, the mortality per 1,000 people in Europe was 10 times less than it was in America. So the Swiss, in spite of having no immunisation policy, had 10 times less mortality from measles than did the United States, which by that state had a 20 years vaccination experience and had mandated it.
The most interesting thing about this situation in the United States is that the Amish, it's a religious group who reject vaccination on religious grounds. The Amish didn't report a single case of measles between 1970 and 1988. For 18 years, the unvaccinated Amish did not report a single case of measles.
But what about smallpox? Hasn't it been eradicated? Well, vaccination seemed, with this too, to only slow the decline which had already been occurring. Dr. Archie Kalakarinos is a medical doctor and author well known for his success with vitamin C in his work with Aboriginal children.
There was a big epidemic of smallpox in the Philippines, and this was a very important epidemic in many ways because statistics were kept for the first time. And it was clearly demonstrated that the only people who got smallpox twice were the vaccinated, and that there were far more cases of smallpox amongst the vaccinated than amongst the non-vaccinated. And these statistics are available if people want to see them. I think these are the most glaring examples of how people are being misled.
Smallpox outbreaks are, in fact, still occurring in Africa, Asia and India, where there is conflict and poor nutrition. So, how do researchers get figures which appear to show that vaccines have been successful? Well, there are many ways. One is through misleadingly strict definitions of vaccinated. Another is how the disease is diagnosed.
I have always been looking for articles that could demonstrate that vaccines work. And when I saw this title, The Elimination of Indigenous Measles, Mumps and Rubella from Finland by a 12-year, 2-dose vaccination program, I said, wow, this is it. This is the article that I've been looking for. So let's have a look how they eliminated indigenous measles, mumps and rubella from Finland. Results. The 99% decrease in the incidence of the three diseases was accompanied by an increasing rate of false positive clinical diagnosis. Another little hook. So these children, Finnish children were still developing measles, mumps, rubella, but they called it false positives. What is a false positive?
Polio is a striking example of what you can achieve when you change the diagnostic criteria, as New Zealand medical doctor David Ritchie will reveal.
In 1954, the Americans pushed forward a polio campaign with the oral Sabin polio vaccine. What happened within the first year was, to their horror, they found that particularly one type of the polio vaccine was causing polio. Because what, of course, the vaccine is not a totally killed virus. You're giving polio in a partly killed form, so-called attenuated form. And so they jumped up and down and got rid of this particular type of polio vaccine. That was fine. Then they realised, to their horror, this is written up, and this is actually reported by Dr. Ratner, who was a public health official in Chicago at the time. The next thing was, they realised that in fact all the different types of oral polio vaccine would cause polio. That also was a bit of a shock. And so they simply ignored that data. That data has never been released really that publicly. You'll find it very hard to find that in the published literature. What they did though was they decided to redefine polio. Prior to that, polio was, by definition, if you had muscle weakness in one limb, one or more limbs, within 2 examinations, 24, 48 hours apart, it was called polio. What they did, the first thing they did was say, okay, polio can only be diagnosed as polio if the person has still got paralysis 60 days later after the actual event. Now, in most cases of polio, of course, the paralysis resolves within the first few days. Very few go on to get permanent paralysis, although, of course, that's the form we see most dramatically. That's more than, I think that cut the amount of polio in the Western world by about 80%, just by changing definition, not by vaccination. They then went a bit further and said, look, there's all sorts of other viruses that can cause a polio-like syndrome. We better make sure they're not included. So they changed the definition again, and they said, okay, polio is now only diagnosable if you can grow the polio virus from the feces and you haven't been immunised in the last month, because of course we excrete the polio virus after immunisation. So by these two rather interesting changes of definition, the rate of polio, the incidence of polio, dropped dramatically in the 1960s.
And now I will show you how they eliminated poliomyelitis in the Americas, meaning South America. In these countries, there are less than 100 reported cases of polio per year. They started vaccinating in 1985. Within 4 months, they had an outbreak of 350 cases. Indeed, these shadowy columns here are reported, notified cases of flaccid paralysis. And these black columns represent confirmed cases. They couldn't do very much about it here or here, but they started fiddling with the figures. So they caused a sustained, huge outbreak of poliomyelitis, but they started discarding most of the cases. That's the word they used in the paper, discarding. But I praise them for publishing it this way.
But what about Australia? Aren't outbreaks occurring due to low vaccination levels? Well, Dr. Mark Donoghue, a Sydney medical doctor, can put us in the picture here.
I also want to say something about where this figure of 51%, we have lower vaccination rates than third world countries. We have a minister who has stood up and said, I intend to get 90% vaccination rates by the time I leave here. You've got to think about this ABS study. The Australian Bureau of Statistics study, right through the paper, says what all the shortcomings are. There are certain states in which it was able to check its information. It found it overestimated the unvaccinated group by a factor of 50%. There were, in fact, when you look at recall, ask the parents, did you vaccinate? Half of the people who said no had actually vaccinated. They just didn't know it. They'd forgotten it. There was some missing information. The Australian Bureau of Statistics does not suggest 51% vaccination rates. It says it's around 51% for a child having got all vaccines from age 1 to 6, all on time. What's the major reason that people didn't get it? It was the Haemophilus influenza B that the doctors didn't even know they should be giving it. 51% is just not true. If you look at the vaccination for the majority of those diseases, you're finding figures between 75 and 90%, exactly the same as have been done in other studies. Why aren't the real figures used? Because it does not suit government to say there isn't a problem. In the push to keep on going and keep on going, figures are drawn out of mid-air. The trouble is we're reporting